Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nathan Merz. I come from Seattle. I actually am a neighbor of Chris Powell's, so we have the privilege to working near each other. And I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the collector car market, specifically as it relates to Porsche. So a little bit different than some of these brand new 2017s we have here. We're going to talk about what the heck is going on in the market. So I label my presentation up, down, or sideways, right? So it depends on how closely you follow this market, but most people are well aware we're 5 years into an unbelievable ride in the Porsche market. So we're going to talk about why that happened, how that happened, and where it's headed. Everyone wants a little crystal ball to know, are we going to continue to go up, or are we going to flatten out? Are we going to burst like a Southern California real estate bubble? What's going to happen here, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Anyone been to one of my presentations before? I don't think so. I've done several regions, but not in California, and I've done Parade. I did Parade in Jay Peak, and I'll be doing Parade this year in Spokane. So Spokane should be an awesome venue. Come on out. It's a beautiful spot if you guys are thinking about Parade this year. So who the heck am I? Why should you listen to who I am? I'll tell you about who that is. I'll give you some basic caveats or limitations of my presentations. I'm going to give you some updates from the summer of 2016, the last time I gave this presentation in Jay Peak. It's even changed just since then. We'll talk about the various models. There are some that are up, there are some that are flat, and there are some that are dropping. So you can think about what's in your garage or maybe what you want to have in your garage. We'll talk about the word bubble. I hate that word actually, but people use that all the time, so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about prices. What are the prices doing? We'll talk about how to grade a car. Right? In this room, we're all very, very proud of our car. Everyone thinks we have #1 cars. We'll discover if we do or we don't, right? We'll talk about various factors that affect a price. The one problem I always have in this market right now is that when prices go up, everyone thinks their car's gone up in lockstep. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes that's not. We'll talk about if you're looking for a car, where you might find it, or on the flip side, if you're selling it, where you might want to list it. There's some interesting intricacies of the market depending on which model you have, where might be the best venue to do that. If we get around to it, we'll talk a little bit about how the heck you pay for it in this kind of world where we're so worried about scams and payment and titles, and there's some weird things when you get into this market. And then hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. So we'll get this kicked off. So who the heck am I? I'm that kid who popped out loving cars. Some kids love baseball, and they could tell you every player that was on the 1945 World Series team. I'm not that guy. I couldn't tell you the least bit about baseball, but I could tell you ridiculous and stupid factoids. I could give you the specifications on an '84 Dodge Caravan. Why that sticks in my head, I don't know. But thankfully, God gave me a dad who liked Porsche, so I didn't have to worry about Dodge Caravans so much. And I used this knowledge to think about Porsche. So I bought my first 911 when I was 16 years old. I had a job at our local Porsche dealer, which is a dream job when you're 16 years old. But I bought my first car when I was 13, old Volkswagens, figured out how to buy and sell those, how to fix those, and then moved to working as service department of a Honda dealer. And then when the doors opened at a Porsche store, that's where I went. So that's a little bit about how I got to this point. And from a dream job perspective, I've been doing this full-time about 10 years. I used to have your very typical corporate job with a nice little domestic, company car in the driveway and the green Amex in my pocket. And I have 4 kids, so I have a very understanding wife who says, okay, quit that good, secure corporate job and be a used car salesman. So when I go to dinner parties, I have to find creative ways of telling people that I'm not like what you think a used car salesman should look like. So it's a good conversation. I've got clients all over the world. That's the fun part of this hobby. I can travel everywhere, and Porsche is a universal language. And I buy and sell about 120 of these cars every single year. So if you buy and sell 120, that means you look at a whole lot more than 120 of them in order to do that. Okay, so basic caveats. The market is dynamic and fast moving, so this presentation was out of date. I tweaked this last night in my hotel room. It's already out of date, right? You're gonna go on the forums, you're gonna go and bring a trailer, there'll be some new auction. We got auctions coming up in January in Scottsdale that people are gonna be talking about. It's moving unbelievably fast, right? We also can't cover every nuance. Porsche's built a ton of cars, a ton of submodels. Everybody has their passion. I've talked to people that their passion is front engine, 4-cylinder cars. I've talked to guys that are 928 people. I've talked to Cayenne people. So there's lots of nuances in this market. There's always an outlier. Usually I get some smart guy in the crowd who'll raise his hand and say, well, what about that car? You know, the Janis Joplin car. And I said, well, it's an outlier, right? So we always have our outliers. I'll talk a little bit about, please buy the Porsche that fits your intended purpose. Sometimes we get caught up in values and what the market likes. Buy the car that fits what you like and the car that fits what you're trying to accomplish, right? And again, these are just my opinions, so feel free to ignore them at your will, right? Okay, so this is an interesting slide. This is borrowed by my friends at Haggerty. I think they actually do a wonderful job. Are they always correct? No. But did they do a really good job in spite of the fact that it's a really challenging thing to try to put your finger on the pulse of this market? And so they're the first ones, I think, to put some real robust data behind this. For those of you who don't know, this data comes from both what their insureds report to them, but they also have a network of dealers, people in the industry that report this information. So this actually gets a lot of information that's maybe not reported or seen in the public space. And so that's one of the reasons I like this data. What I did just to create this slide was kind of fun, is I took sort of maybe a typical PCA person's garage. And this person's done pretty well. They like their air-cooled Porsches. And so I gave them kind of a selection of 6, right? So they've got an 83 911 SC, a first-year Cabrio. They've got an RS America. They have a 73 S, which is an amazing car. They've got a 74, a mid-year. They've got an 89 Speedster, one of my favorites as well. And of course a 67S. So let's say that's your garage. If you go back to 5 years ago, you can see the total value of their garage really, I mean, they'd have substantial investment there, but it was pretty static. And you can see, you know, in 11 and 12, not a whole lot's happening. And all of a sudden you see from January of 13, it just went nuts, right? Everyone familiar with what was happening there? Now you can start just barely seeing at the end of the summer, things started to trail off and flatten out a little bit. Now let's look at the slide that's update as of yesterday. So broken out just a little bit more. I take that back. That's not the one I want. Okay, so this is the most current one. So this one goes through September. Okay, an interesting reference point. This is the Dow. So you can see what the Dow's done. Now, the funny thing about this slide, because these have done so well, this looks really poor. But the Dow, you see it over here, is up 50%. That's a 10% rate of return over 5 years. So the Dow's actually done quite well during this period of time. But you can see the difference if you would have had a portfolio of cars, what that looks like. So any of us who've been around the block long enough would realize no market can perform like that long term. For 2 reasons. One, the biggest reason is there'll be a point at which none of us can afford to buy the cars that are in our own garage, right? You can't have 200, 300, 400% growth on these cars year after year. So at some point, it starts to cool off. Most of us would sort of agree that the high point in the market sort of hit summer of 15. You know, from there, I would say the overall market has plateaued slightly, but there are still bright spots, cars that are doing well. There's cars that have corrected more so than others. We'll get into what some of those are. Okay, so overall market. We've entered a plateau phase after 5 years of record growth. The complex answer, Porsche market's still excellent, right? If you've owned a car more than a few years, you've done just fine on it, right? Some models are still scorching hot. We're going to talk about what those models are. Some are warm, many are flat, and there are a few that are dropping, but they're not dropping to 2011 levels. So if you're sitting on the sidelines waiting to get that 89 Speedster for $45,000, yeah, don't keep waiting. Okay, so let's talk. This is a very, very busy slide, so it's more just for me, but you can kind of look at this. There are some bright spots. Number one bright spots, true number one and number twos, and we're going to talk about what number one and number two cars look like, okay? Most people don't really understand what those cars look like. Survivors, those are still scorching hot. Those are finding a home very easily. 964 manual coupes, I have a very strong affinity for 964s. They were the, like I always tell people, Porsche has a long history of always having a car they have to step on and talk smack about, right, as PCA guys. So if you've been around long enough, the 356 guys were just abhorred when the 911 came out. Oh my gosh, you know, what's wrong with that car, right? And then it was the mid-year car. My first 911 was a 75 911. And I remember going to my first PCA meeting, I was like 18, and the older guys in the room would like politely pat me on the head and say, oh, one day you'll get a real 911. I was pretty sure I had a real 911, but, right? And then it was 964s. Oh, they're leaky, oh, they're ugly bumpers, right? And now us poor owners of 996s feel that way sometimes, right? So we got a long history of this. But 964s now are the blessed and chosen one in the air-cooled market right now. Who would have thought? G50 3.2 Carreras are still doing very, very well. M491 cars, you know, the wide-body turbo-look cars. Mid-years, finally. People are saying, well, they got a little Daco trim, they got nice light steering, they're really elemental, they're still reasonably priced. Okay, makes sense. Most of the 2.7 issues have probably been absolved by this point. The Carrera 3 liters that people always thought were just a Euro SC, and they discovered, no, there's something magical here, right? Euro RS cars. We're getting to the point where those cars have passed the 25 years, or they're right on the 25-year import rule. So 964 RSs, 993 RSs are knocking on the door. I get a lot of people that say to me, well, should I start buying those cars in Europe and salting them away for, 2018? I said, you missed that boat. People already have done that, right? So, modern car, 996 twin turbo. People are discovering you cannot get more car for more money, or less money than a 996 twin turbo. 914 2 liters, right? 73 and 74 cars, done really, really well. And then actually, here's a fun one, 928, particularly early cars. You couldn't give away an early 928, and people are dying for, particularly if you have one of like a manual and Porsche, oh man, right? Remember showing up with a Porsche 928 10 years ago? I mean, they would have, like Rod talked about, you have to park in the dirt. Yeah, that was the car you had to park in the dirt. And now all of a sudden you're in the front row. It's amazing how that works. Cars that are about right, really any regular 356s, short wheelbase cars, the long hood, 69 to 73, Carrera 2.7 RSs, any of your 915 era SCs and 3.2s, the early 930s that just had stratospheric ride, they're holding steady, but they're not going up like they were. Normally aspirated 993s, you can kind of look through the list, but that's kind of your market of stuff that's kind of holding its own. Stuff that's cooling off right now, early S cars, like the 67 S's have come just a smidge off their peak. 73 Carrera S's, you can see some of the public sales didn't materialize. There's some reasons for that too, but 89 Speedsters. So the easiest way to know if a car is cooling off, look at the Haggerty chart. The ones that have a straight upward trajectory, they've gone up 400%. Those just naturally are gonna cool a little bit. 930s, your plain Jane 930s, your 78 to 88 cars have cooled. RS Americas, that I personally have one, so that kills me a little bit, but they are cooling out. Wide body 993s. It used to be wide body 993s were 60, 65 grand. They all of a sudden became 110. All of a sudden now they're back to 80 or 90, right? Same with 993 twin turbos. They went from 70 to 180 like in 2 days. Not really sure how that happened. 991s, of course, are cooling because 991.2s are coming out and they're depreciating more like a modern car. But all the other cars, it has to do with oversaturation. So basic economic theory says when prices go up, more stuff floods the market because people get opportunistic. So if you had a 993 twin turbo in your garage and it was worth $70,000 like it was for 10 years, and you loved it and it became worth $80,000, I still love my car. When it became 180, there were spouses and other people that said, honey, we're underfunded on kids' college, or we'd really like that second home. or whatever, and all of a sudden these cars started appearing. And that's why when you go out and you look, there's just a lot more cars on the market than there were not too long ago. Okay, there are still some great values out there. I'm a big proponent of the Metzger motor turbos, 996, 997 turbos. They've come up. 996 turbos generally were 40K-ish. They're up about 10 grand, give or take, but still an amazing car. You can buy a pretty good car in the 42 to 55 range. 997 twin turbos are flat as a pancake. They've been $70,000, give or take 10 grand for 5 years. Amazing amount of car for the money. 915 era SCs and 32s I think are still a great value because they haven't got incredibly hot. They're hot, but they're not. You can still buy a pretty decent car. It starts with a 3. I think that's a lot of car for, new Honda money. Air-cooled open cars. If you're a 356 guy, you know the basic rule is the top goes down, the price goes up, right? Total opposite in the air-cooled 911 market. Open cars sell at a discount, which is so weird.
993 convertible.
Yeah.
Can't get rid of it.
Exactly, right? So if I were thinking about a great value, you can buy an identical from a quality standpoint, be it an SC cab, 3.2 career cab, 964, 993 cab, probably at about a 30% discount to a like coupe. So if you're open to one, I think that's a pretty good buy in the market. And I think as the future rolls on and it becomes less about the driving experience and more about the presence of the car, I think that that gap is gonna close up. Just my theory. 914 2-liters, again, because they're a great entree point. They've gotten way more expensive than you ever thought they would be, but still in the grand scheme, they're pretty reasonable. 06 to 2012 997s are great cars, particularly the .2s with the 9A1 series of motors. As Chris talked about, no IMS issues on those cars. Only problem with those is they're very rare, because if you recall, 2009 to 11, market wasn't really so good for new cars, right? Same with Boxers and Cayman of that genre. Well-sorted 996s, 986s. Gosh, you can buy a really nice 996 coupe with all the right updates in the low 20s. I mean, to me, that's silly. That's way too much car for that kind of money, right? The other thing is, if some of these hot models kind of combine with the next thing, the panic seller, right? Some of these people that paid big money for, your Guards Red 86 930, if they were smart, then maybe they decide they want to offload. So now might actually be a time to buy some stuff. Okay, so here's the word bubble, right? Are we in a bubble? No. A bubble pops, right? It's catastrophic. It's owning real estate in Phoenix 5 years ago, right? Market's simply correcting. It's a totally different thing. So think of it as a balloon. We're letting a little bit of air out of the balloon. We're not popping the balloon, right? So again, we think the market sort of peaked around summer of 2015. Really about 6 months ago, because we had about a year where no one could quite figure out what was happening, and so you weren't really seeing much change in pricing. Now that we're probably a good 12 plus months into this, you're starting to see even asking prices starting to come down a smidge. One of the issues is you had all these speculators entering the market. This kills me. Like, I speak Porsche, I eat and breathe, Porsche. I'm the guy who's got the Porsche Christmas tree ornaments, right? There's a lot of us in this room. But I started meeting more and more people that knew nothing about the brand, and that's wonderful as long as they're coming in and want to be part of that and experience it. But when they start saying, I'm pulling money out of my 401k to buy a Porsche, I get really scared. I mean, it's just, there's no business there. And then even in my line of work, there were a lot of dealers that I jokingly say, 2 weeks ago they were selling toilets and now they're selling 930s, right? And as soon as toilets are hot again, they're gonna dump 930s and go sell toilets again. So there's a lot of that. And then supply is an interesting one. One of the things I do just because, probably like a lot of you in the evening, I'm in a hotel and I sit on my computer and instead of watching reality TV, I look at cars for sale. And 24 months ago, if you would have logged on like say Auto Trader or eBay or any of those things, eBay is a perfect example. 24 months ago, if you would have said, give me every air-cooled 911 from 65 to 98, they were running anywhere between 150 and 180 cars at any given time. If you go do that same search today, I did it last night, 528 cars popped up. Well, that gives you some indication, right? Same thing with Auto Trader. You can only do it from 81 and newer on AutoTrader. 81 to 98, air-cooled 911. There's almost 600 cars on there. And then you'll also see sub-models. So if you're interested in your own, that's a really good way to do it. Like look at 993 twin turbos. There's a bazillion of them. Amazing car, by the way. That's basically the one way to really look at it. It's just more inventory out there. And then again, the growth rates just weren't sustainable. And then the other thing that was concerning is when I see an outlier and someone says, hey, I paid $100,000 for a 3.2 G50 coupe, which we would think is nuts, right? But it's a true number one, 10,000 mile, one owner car. That doesn't bother me in the least. I think, okay, you can't replicate that car. When I hear of a guy paying $70,000 for a repainted 180,000 mile Guards Red 78 Targa, yeah, I get nervous, right? So, you know, and that's what we were seeing. We were seeing that, well, if that one's 100, well, then mine's got to be 80. Well, not necessarily, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so what's the market going to do? This is what everyone wants to know. Number one point is incorrect pricing will lead people to perceive a larger drop than actual. So a lot of people base the market based on asking prices, but they aren't necessarily privy to transactional pricing. And so what happened as we had this huge spike is if I had a car for sale, I looked and I said, oh, there's 5 cars for sale and they're all 100, but the market's up, so I'm going to price mine at 120. Well, this guy right here has the same car, so he logs on the next day and goes, well, he's asking 120, I'm going to ask 140, right? See what was happening there? Now, the ones at 100 haven't even sold yet, but we're 3 steps ahead of the market. So I think that's what you were seeing there, and the thought was, well, if you don't buy today, it's going to be 180 tomorrow, so boy, you better move quick. And so we had this frenzy that was happening. So you'll see a lowering, I think, of asking prices, but I don't know that transactional prices as a percentage will drop as much. The other thing is I firmly believe many Porsches were undervalued historically. Current values are closer to market correct. For those of you who've been in this a while, my second Porsche I bought a 1979 911 SC Coupe. Black, 60,000 miles, spectacular car. I paid $18,000 for that car. And I loved that car. I had it for about 5 years, and I sold it to another club member. And I think I had 68 or 70,000 miles. And he paid me $18,500. And I thought I was pretty smart. All right? I paid $500. I enjoyed this car. I met some nice young ladies in this car. And I was doing good. So he had that car about 5 years, and then he called me and he says, hey, I'm getting myself a new 996. And do you know anyone who might want my SC? I said, sure. So I called a friend of mine and said, hey, my old SC's for sale. It's got about 80,000 miles. I used to own it. Great car. And he says, well, how much is it? And I said, well, I think he wants like 19 grand. So he bought it for $19,000. You can kind of figure the story. So I've now sold that car 4 times, all right? The last guy paid $18,500. He got a deal. One guy lost money, right? So 4 enthusiasts have driven this car over a period of 20 years, and it hasn't cost anybody $500, which is, to me, is awesome, right? I love that period of Porsche history, actually. I owned a lot of cars that never cost me any money. Now, the funny thing is, I would argue, though, that's more car than $18,000 represents. $18,000 isn't a lot of money, right? Go buy a new car for $18,000, and I can tell you what it's going to be. It's a new Ford Focus. I have one out in the parking lot if you want to test drive it. Yeah, no, it's a rental. And yeah, so now that same car is probably worth $35,000, right? Okay, that's more in line, I think, intrinsically what it's worth. So that's kind of my point. I think for a while they were undervalued. And I think there's still some models out there that are undervalued. Basic 996s, I just think they're more car than $20,000. Right? Maybe I'm crazy. Okay, the other thing that's unique about Porsche is that they have true global demand and they have appeal across all age ranges. So, case in point, I don't know how this happened. I think my dad must have suffered a head injury because when I was a kid, he liked cool British cars, and he liked Porsches, and now he's a member of the Ford V8 Club. So I don't know. Something happened there. Now, when I go to his house, he's got these Survivor Ford V8s, and they're really interesting cars. But we can talk about it, and we share our love of cars, but I don't have a particular affinity for that car. That's my dad's generation, right? Now, what's interesting, though, is if I go drive one of my early long hood cars, I can have 8-year-old boys give me thumbs up when I'm driving that car. And I got the 80-year-old guy with the walker, and he's giving me a thumbs up, right? And I got middle-aged women, and everybody thinks that's a cool car. That's sort of unique in the collector car market, right? It appeals across all ages. The The other thing that's unique is that I love these cars because when I was a kid, I had that poster, the little justification for higher education on my wall, right? And I used to daydream that one day maybe I'll be lucky enough to have this car. But what's interesting is that same poster, maybe in a different language, hung on a kid's wall in Japan, right? And in Germany and Australia. Now you reflect back to some of the American collector cars, the kid in Japan didn't lust after a 69 Z28. He just didn't, right? He didn't see that car driving down the street. The rich kid's dad didn't have one, right? That's what kind of fuels our car passion. So what's interesting is you think as the world gets bigger and bigger, it's not just us that like these cars. And so there still aren't enough good cars to go around, and I think that's why you're not going to see an absolute implosion on pricing. We talked about the plateau phase. The other thing is the true number one cars and the very, very rare submodels will still see strong price growth. And that's due to the fact that there's just too many dollars in the world chasing too few assets. So the best way I can describe that is I have a lot of just regular, great, amazing customers, and then I have a few customers that truly have no budget. So if they want a particular car, and let's say I offer them a car and it's 90% of what they want, and they can buy it for 50 cents on the dollar, let's say, they don't care. They'll pay 200% of market to get the one exactly that they want, or 400%, right? So, and there's enough of those people that sort of chase those few cars, so you're going to start seeing a bigger delta between the true number one and the driver quality stuff. So that'll be sort of interesting. Obviously, as we talk about a global market, it has a lot to do with what the dollar is doing, what the euro is doing, what our friends in Great Britain are doing, right? This all plays into it. So as recently as 24 months ago, I could have sold every car I had 3 times over to a European buyer. I made the decision business-wise 5 years ago that I wasn't going to sell any of the cars I wanted to keep, because I'm hoping if I sell you a car, I can get it back at some point. That's my future business. That's my pipeline. I don't have Weissach generating new cars for me to sell, right? Eventually those will be classics I'll be selling, but I'll never have another 67 911S, right, that I can get back, right? I can't make a new one. So, but when currency changes, that'll change the outlook. I think you're going to start seeing more and more cars being offered in from other markets. We're getting a lot of the really high dollar collectibles out of Japan right now. Cars are coming back in from Europe, which we didn't think was going to happen, but it's happening at the top end of the market, and that will trickle down. And then the other thing is these subpar cars. Those are the ones that are probably the most exposed, because when you have more selection, people obviously pick the cream off the top. They're not going to pick the stuff at the bottom. Okay, so number one, don't buy a Porsche as an investment. Please, 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 please don't do that. Buy it because you love it. Buy it because when you come home from work and you're pissed off and you've had a bad day and you hit the garage door opener and it's there smiling at you and says, yes. Or if you're the lucky type who lives somewhere with really nice weather year-round, if you're actually driving it home from work and it's made your life better, so when you come home you don't want to kick the dog, right? Same deal. So that's number one. Number two, if you buy wisely, you're going to limit your exposure to wide swings in value. The other thing that's kind of nice is up to a year ago, you felt like you had about 19 seconds to make a buying decision. Car popped up, there were 10 people waving cash, and you had to say, I'll take it. Breathe a little bit, right? There's more cars on the market, it's not moving as quickly, so you have the opportunity to make a smarter decision, to employ a guy like a Chris Powell, whoever the Chris Powell in your local market is, to look at the car and say, here's some stuff, some ugly parts Chris is going to show you a photo on this car you're going to PPI, right? And then my other rule is, when we get together as a group and we're doing Porsche stuff, let's talk about technical stuff. Let's talk about where Porsche is going. Let's talk about the new car you're ordering. Let's talk about everything except for about the values. It seems like I go to more and more of these meetings and everyone just huddles around and talks about how awesome values are, right? Prices. The first key of setting a price is knowing what you have. That seems really obvious, right? But too often people don't understand not only maybe what they have, but where their car fits in the relative scheme of things. I would say 90% of the time people overestimate what they have, but every so often, right, we get someone that underestimates what they have because they're so particular or whatever. They think everyone thinks the way they think, and they just don't realize that they're the outlier, right? A lot about knowing the value of a car is knowing about its relative place in Porsche history, right? Look at the car behind us. Think what that history does for that value of that car, right? So knowing, the relative place in history, the general pros and cons, so be knowledgeable about what people are concerned about. If you have a 996 or a 32, people worried about broken head studs on an SC, or are they worried about valve guides on a 993, right? IMS bearings on a 996, right? And we'll talk about how to understand how to grade a car. So let's talk about that. I have my little unicorn here. And a unicorn, I love that because a unicorn does not exist in the wild, right? So a true number one car, I always tell people, it doesn't exist. So this is the definition that Haggerty gives. And I think it's a really pretty good definition. It basically says it's the finest or the best in the world, right? The visual image is the best car in the right colors driving out of the lawn at the finest Concours, right? So this doesn't mean our little wash and shine at the PCA. What I always tell people is that a true number one car is created through hundreds of hours worth of work, right? It's the car that started life as a number two, and then sickos like me had it on a lift for a year, and every night they brush away underneath and they work at stuff, right? It's a true no excuses car. Grade 2 cars. A grade 2 car is an amazingly nice car. It's a shockingly nice car. It's a car that could win its class at Parade. It can win its class at any of the local Concours. It's the one that, there's 10 people in the club lined up. If you ever sell that car, I'm going to buy it. You're going to know if you have a number 2 car, right? This is a really, really nice car. I would say this is generally less than 5% of the population of a given model. As the cars get older, they become more and more rare. It's obviously easier to find a number 2, 991.1 than it would be to find even a 997 in that same condition, right? Grade 3s. These are the majority of the PCA member cars. This is a car that's loved, right? Someone really cares about it. They park in that safe parking spot, right? They don't run it through the automatic car wash. They've got a nice little file folder of all the maintenance. They take it to a good shop, right? This is a pretty nice car. But it's not a perfect car, right? It's going to have, maybe it's had paint work on a fender where your kid dropped his bike on it and you wanted to die, but you love your kid, so you didn't kill him, right? But it's a really, really nice car. It's a car you're very proud to own. A number 4. This is the vast majority of the cars that are on the market, right, that you're going to see out there. They're a running, driving, decent car. They just have some needs, right? Some of us like to buy these cars because the needs is kind of the fun thing. I have this weird habit of I get a car and I create a little punch list, and I kind of like just checking off all the items and how do I make my car, a nicer car than it was, right? Now, an interesting thing about this four grade scale is everyone thinks that, okay, if there's only 4 grades, well, my car is clearly not the worst, so it can't be a 4, right? And I know it's not perfect, so it's not a 1, so it's a 2, right? What they forget is that it doesn't mean there aren't cars below a grade 4. They're just not collectible, right? They're not evaluated on that scale. So there's plenty of 5, 6, 7, 8s, and 9s. We've seen them, right? So don't think 4 is the bottom. 4 just represents really what we're... Once you get below that, it's really hard to start evaluating the numbers. You got to look at what it would cost to bring the car up to at least a grade 4, right? A couple things to know. Standards fall gently over time. What I would consider to be a number 1, 67 911S Survivor car, if there even is one out there in the world, looks really different than what I would expect some guy who pulls up in his new 718, right? It's going to fall a little bit over time. You can give little pluses and minuses. A car could be a 2 plus or a 2 minus, 3 plus, something like that. And then again, cars below 4, they're just evaluated on what it would cost to bring it up there. So you might have a car that's a full restoration or those kinds of things. Okay, let's talk about original versus restored. This has sort of changed over time. In my opinion, and I think the market will bear this out, a truly original car will outperform a restored car only if it's truly a number 2 or higher, right? One of my pet peeves is that this word survivor, I think it comes out of the Corvette background. So everyone says, oh, I got a survivor. And I said, well, I'm going to argue with you there. If the car is physically in front of you, by very definition, it's a survivor. It's here. It's survived. The key is it has to have survived well, right? So I jokingly tell people that if I, for some reason, fail at this Porsche thing, I'm actually going to start a business, and I'm going to have a mobile truck, and I'm going to go to Amelia Island, I'm going to go to Scottsdale, I'm going to go to Monterey, and it's just going to have a big back of the truck. It's going to be full of dirt and bird droppings and crap, and I'm just going to take a leaf blower, and I'll hose the car down, and then I'm just blow dust and dirt on all the cars, and they'll be worth 50% more. Because has anyone ever noticed you go to the auction with the barn find, and somehow they've moved that car around, there's no handprints on it? If you've ever had a car in your shop and you've done any work at all, there's always handprints on it, but these barn finds never have any handprints. I'm like, this is a miraculous thing. I'm patenting that idea if anyone thinks that's a good idea, by the way. The other thing is restored cars. A lot of people make the assumption the car's restored, it's a number one. No. Very, very, very few restorations are truly done to a number one standard because you can't justify them. You know, the cost to do a true number one restoration might be 2 or 3x what it might be to do a number two restoration, right? So it depends on what a person wanted. And generally, there's no good investment unless you have one of the very, very rare cars that you can afford a number one restoration on the typical Porsches we see. There's obviously cars like in the back, right? That's a whole different animal. Okay, how to set or know a fair price. Rule number one, it's not an exact science, but there are some definite guideposts you can use. My biggest thing is I talk a lot about real estate. Anyone who has a house or commercial property or anything knows when you do an appraisal, it's all about knowing your comparables. So in this market, particularly now that there's more inventory out there, just go out and look at all your venues and see. Put your hat on like you're a buyer. Okay, I've decided I want a mid-year coupe. Okay, well, I'm going to go on every venue. I'm going to see what's out there. Because if I were looking, where would my car fit? And you can kind of build a matrix. And okay, I found 12 of these for sale, and mine's nicer than these 3 and about the same as these ones. And you can kind of do little pluses and minuses, right? That's kind of how that's done. But know that subtle differences make a huge difference among the same model. So when in doubt, consult people that know quite a bit. Because sometimes you'll see cars that'll pop up on the market and someone won't fully appreciate how rare. I'll give you a perfect example for those of you who know anything about 993s. If you have a 993 and it's 1995 and you're a dealer and somehow you get stuck with a Riviera Blue 993 coupe, you pray to God every day someone's going to come buy this car. It's unsaleable. Fast forward to 2016, if you have a Riviera Blue 95 993 coupe, it's worth 2x of any other color. Right? Who knew, right? So, perfect example. If you have that car, you better know that because you're going to be really, really mad when you discover you sold it for 50 and the guy turned around and sold it at 120, right? So, know what the subtle differences are. And then take the time to study the market long term. You'll start getting a feel for those subtle nuances, right? Or consult an expert or two. There's lots of people out there with a lot of knowledge. And the other thing is too high is just as bad as too low. I meet a lot of sellers. I don't sell a lot of cars on consignment. I do some, but I generally like to own my cars. Mostly because I get sellers, let's say the car's worth 100, they'll say, well, just ask 120, it'll be fine. It actually isn't. It's really weird. You could have a car, even at a pretty high number, and you can be off $5,000 and it just won't sell. Maybe it's a cultural thing. People here don't like to bargain, or they just think that you're crazy. They just won't even reach out. So if you're priced right, the car will sell. If you're not, it just somehow will magically grow legs and decide it wants to stay. Okay, let's talk about value guides. First, I have great empathy for guys that do the value guides. They get a lot of grief from a lot of us. Say, oh, crazy, they don't even make sense. So we'll talk about the value guides. You have your sort of typical car value guides, your Kelley Blue Book, your NADA, your Edmunds. Those are super useful if you have a 2014 Honda Accord Sport package. They're within 10 cents of what the value of the car is. There's just a huge market. If you really think they're going to have a good pulse on what a 996 twin turbo with X50 package is worth, no. They can't possibly, so you got to forgive them for that, right? And even the ones, like I think Hagerty probably does the best job. But again, it's really dynamic. I said my presentation's already outdated. It's 24 hours old, right? Excellence, I think, does a pretty good job if you read their limitations on the bottom, which is they're oriented towards drivers, and they don't make any adjustment for really condition or mileage. So there's some limitations there. Neta Classics has gotten better. I mean, perfect example, 993s. Up till like 3 years ago, the Neta value on a used 993 coupe was like $13,000. I was like, wow, I wish I could buy some of those. Okay, let's talk about mileage. Mileage is the number one factor affecting price. As a general rule, of course, the lower the mileage, the higher the value. And it's a little bit of a hockey stick. I mean, you start getting into super low mileage, you know, that rare car that's got, 12 original miles. That's a totally different animal, right? The things to know, late model cars, 99 and newer, digital odometer, Carfax, pretty viable. Mileage discrepancy is a pretty unusual thing. Mileage discrepancy on older Porsche, epidemic. Epidemic. Like I tell people, there should be a hockey, or basically a bell curve. You remember back to college and you had to learn about grading on a curve. I tell people every 911 SC for sale in the country has 70,000 miles. Like, how is that possible? Right? There should be a range, but there never is. So in fact, sometimes when I get one that shows 160, I'm like, thank you, God. At least it's real, right? So there's a lot of reasons for that, of course. Any of the cars through 77 had a 5-digit odometer. The 79 to 82 cars had the 85s. Anyone remember those, right? I argue till I'm blue in the face with people. Sometimes they pull up with an SC from 82 and it's got a 160 mile an hour speedometer. And I said, well, when was that changed? Oh, no, that's original to the car. No, it's not, right? A fun little trick if you ever want to do it, the gauges are just held in by a rubber gasket. It's really fun if people don't get offended. You can just sometimes pull it out and spin it around and it's got a date stamp from 89 on their 82 car. Usually they look at you with big eyes. So that's why my next documentation is key. So what I want to see is I want to see all the documentation that basically supports what that mileage is. If you have an unbroken chain of documentation, you're golden, right? But most people don't. They'll say they have documentation and you'll find out they have 5 years worth shoved in the glove box. Well, what happened the last 30 years, right? And the other thing is car condition should be reflective of mileage. One of my favorite stories, this person shall remain unnamed, but there's a very well-known seller that had a 71 911E Target for sale down in Scottsdale a few years back with a claimed 5,000 original miles. I actually should have put the picture up. 5,000 mile car, and as I was looking over the car, there were a lot of anomalies. But the biggest one that stood out in my head, for anyone who's had an early car knows that rubber floor mat. I swear to God, Porsche, like it's out of iron or something, right? But this one had a hole worn all the way down through that rubber under the gas pedal. I was a very nervous driver in 5,000 miles. In fact, I would swear they just didn't drive it because they were so nervous those first 5,000 miles. They just, I can't drive it anymore. So again, condition should be reflective of mileage. Now here's a fun thing. If you own anything 73 and older, you get a free pass. Nobody cares what the mileage is. Doesn't matter. It's actually a little bit of honesty in the market that reflects, you know what, except for the very rare circumstance, there are a couple that you can actually document them, but most of them, they're all truly mileage unknown. So there, the car's condition is basically what matters. How does the car present? So it's kind of a freebie. You can just drive it as much as you want. Nobody cares. It's all about condition. So again, condition trumps mileage. Okay, rarity. Okay, obviously more rare cars command a premium. Pretty straightforward. Porsche has a long history of basically sort of a break. I'll break them in two, right? You have true mechanically or visibly distinct submodels, and then you have Porsche marketing, who's really good as they're closing out a model. Oftentimes they'll come up with something cool with very Porsche, signed the headrest, right? Awesome cars, but, right? Still great cars, they're still collectible. But, like, take that car as an example, right? In 88, you could have gotten the Ferry Porsche Special Edition with some really shiny leather. It's cool, great color. Or you could have an 88 Club Sport. Which one's worth a lot more money, right? You know, huge factor. So just something to think about when you're buying something. The other thing is, some people will tell me that I always hate to do this in a room, so I've got to pick a combo no one probably has. I've got a Wimbledon green 968 Cabriolet with a dark rootwood dash and shift knob, and I think it's a one of one. Okay, you probably do, right? I mean, it's very possible. But some things are rare, but not necessarily desirable. They're rare because no one wanted it to begin with, right? So sometimes you gotta, and I hope nobody has that car. I should have picked one they really didn't even make. A Sportomatic 968 cab, there you go. Okay, so sometimes you'll know, right? There's just those cars, right? And then here's your outliers, your special wishes cars, right? Your cars with racing history, your celebrity ownership. Throw those out the window. Those are just gonna, you can't really put a predictor on some of those things because that is what someone's willing to pay for them. Okay, history. Everyone loves a one-owner car. I don't know why. They could be the world's worst owner, but a one owner is always better. In fact, I told a guy in the back of the room, here's one of my favorite stories. I have a customer of mine who, God bless him, he's a genius in his field. He's very well respected in cancer research. Just one of the brightest people we ever meet. But I think he's too gifted in one area, right? So he's one of those guys, his fly's unzipped and his hair's unkept, but he loves cars. So he called me the other day and he's got a GT3 RS 997.2. He's the original owner. It's very low miles. He says, come over, I think I want to get a new car. Okay. Well, I get there and I open up the passenger door and it looks like some sort of giant rodent just had a heyday on the dash. I mean, just chewed to bits. And I'm looking at that going, holy crap. What happened? And I said, Peter, what? And he says, oh, Nate, this is great. It's one of the reasons I've not thought about not selling this car. It's worked so good. He goes, I don't know if you know this, but I'm an avid cyclist, and I figured out that if I roll the seat back and I take the front wheel off, I can shove the bike in, and then the forks just sit right there on the dash. He thought he was pretty smart. He goes, I hated having a rack, and this just works so good. But he's an original owner, right? So there you go. Low ownership is second best. Documentation. I love when I have a window sticker and every little thing and the little handwritten notes. For those of us who keep those notes and our spouse or our friends make fun of you, it's okay. I keep a little log, right? Where it comes from makes a difference. We're blessed. We're in car culture here in California. Our cars are better than they are anywhere else. I like stuff from the West Coast. Plenty of friends back east. But you crawl underneath a car that's spent its life in Vermont or Indiana, it's not a pretty sight, right? So we love our good, dry West Coast cars. Clean title and Carfax. Carfax is one of my banes of my existence, but unfortunately in today's world, a car with a bad Carfax is a really hard car to sell. Just the reality. And then a lot of people ask about salvage titles. Salvage titles are always of huge impact. I don't care. Everyone has a good story as to why, but unless it was crashed at Le Mans, yeah, no, not a good story. Okay, options. Huge difference. Color, we talked about like Riviera Blue. And color preferences change over time. So colors that, generally, if you can think of it's unusual color, a lot of times in the future it's going to be worth more, right? And again, color and options can make as much as a 1 or 2x difference on a given car. The more highly or unusually optioned a car, the more desirable. And again, a split. Performance options generally bring a higher return on investment. So if you're deciding you're speccing out a new car, you're going to do better getting adaptive sport seats and sport exhaust or leather door finishers and leather vents, you'll do better with the sports options than you will on the trim and tchotchke options, if you will. The other thing is anything prior to PDK, so Tiptronics and Sportomatics, we could argue all day about it, it's a huge hit on value. It just is. Doesn't make them bad cars, just means the market's not as much for them. I'm over on time, aren't I? Okay. Factors, price, and price condition. So we'll talk about the grade of the vehicle, right? PPI, again, find your local Chris Powell. Every one of us regions has multiple people like that are very, very smart. The other thing is sometimes I get people that they'll get a PPI or they'll look at a car and they'll say, well, this car needs $7,000 out of the work, so my offer is $7,000 less than the price. Unfortunately, it's not really generally a dollar for dollar. If you get a seller like that, you've been blessed, but generally that's not the case. And then us silly people, I call them the tchotchkes, your tool kit. I bought a 964 yesterday, and I think the guy felt a little bit mad that I pointed out that it was missing. There's a little thing that goes in the center cap to pull the cap off. And I said, oh, it's missing as well as your spark plug. And You know, he felt like I'd called his wife ugly or something, but we like our toolkits, you know, your air pumps, your window sticker. Please don't shove it in the glove box. Like, do something nice with it, you know? You know, having all your books and your spare keys and all that stuff matters, right? Okay, originality. So, this is really simple. The more original, the more valuable. If you come to my personal garage, I've got some very, very original cars. I've got modified cars. I would encourage people to make the car your own. It's your car. Please do. But just know that at the end of the day, when you go to sell it, it's always most valuable original. So I tell people what I do for a living is I take all the work of all these PCA people that have been super passionate and I reverse it. I buy a lot of original radios and original wheels and, you know, and I take all that stuff back out and I put it back to original. So again, if you want to modify your car, please do, right? It's part of our culture, but just keep the original parts. Easily reversible things like wheels, radios, exhaust, stuff like that. That's pretty straightforward. You'll improve your sales price and your market time will drop in an original car. Because the thing I always tell people, if you have an original car, people can like it or not like it, but they can't really argue with it. It just is what it is. You know, if you have a different choice and you say, I want to trim out the interior a different way, well then someone has to like what you're doing. You know, they can't really argue with what Porsche did. And then again, non-reversible modifications. You know, you decide to put a cage in the car or weld up the sunroof or something. I mean, that's your choice, and it's awesome. I have no problem with it. God bless you, I've done it to a few of mine. But just know you're going to lower your market value, right? The good news is, though, if you have a grade 4 car, it matters way less than if you have a number 1, right? Or a number 2. Okay, paint. Original paint. People talk about original paint all the time. This is a big, big deal. Cars with original paint are always more valuable, right? The higher number of painted panels, the bigger the hit. Because if you have non-original paint, then the question is always why, which is why documentation is also key. So if your kid's bike did fall on it, save all that documentation, take a nice photo of it, so in the future you can answer that question, right? A car that's a total repaint is just judged on the merits of its quality. Did a father and son wet down the garage floor and paint it over the weekend? Or do they go to a really high-end place and it's done very, very well? And then in my world, just so you know, most people will tell me their car has original paint, and then the next question I always ask is, I said, oh, what basis do you say that? And the number one answer is, it looks original. I said, well, that's a better answer than it doesn't look original, right? But it's not really a great standard. So the number one standard, I should have got it out of my bag, I carry this with me at all times, is a paint meter. Anyone here in the room seen a paint meter who's familiar with these? Paint meters come in all sorts of varieties, shapes, and colors. I've got like a really nice German Felco one, but frankly, these $299 specials, I can lose them, drop them, I don't really care. These are great because we don't need to be that exact. Anything water-cooled, 996 and newer, they'll measure, they're painted robotically at the factory, they'll measure within 1.5 mils on every panel like clockwork. You start getting into air-cooled 911s, there's greater variability. So there's some skill used in how you want to read these things, but what you're looking for is an outlier. So if you're paint metering a car and it meters 4 or 5 mils on every panel and you get a 12 on a quarter panel, it's been painted, right? So something to know there. So again, air-cooled cars should read between 3.5 and maybe 6.5, maybe a 7. You know, that should be kind of the range they should read. Water-cooled cars, 4 to 5.5. Like if I put my paint meter on one of these cars, that's what it'll read definitively. Right? The other thing is, not that you can't fool a paint meter, right? So now you want to look for evidence, you know, your tape lines in the jambs, rough edges on the back of the panels. Generally what happens is people pay attention to what people see. It's human nature, right? So look in places they don't expect you to look. Texture's a big one. Porsche for a long time used a fair amount of orange peel. Most people prefer a flatter paint than that. And so most of the time when they paint them actually too nice, right? Not enough flaw in them. And then there's a lot of debate about, you know, factory quality control, port damage, and lot damage. As kind of like a vindication for all the sins I committed when I worked at the dealership. One of the things I was responsible for was when cars came in on the truck, we walked around with a little clipboard, we inspected the cars, and if there was any damage, we just sent it off to the local body shop. We never thought anything of it. We never told customers. I feel bad about that, admitting that in front of a room of Porsche people, but You can't sell a new Porsche that's got a scratch in the fender, right? So you just painted it. It wasn't a big deal. So there's lots of instances like that. The cars were shipped on an open deck of a ship, you know, so things happened, right? They didn't have the nice, you see a new Porsche that comes in all that nice white wrapper. They didn't have that back then. They had Cosmoline, right? And again, a paint meter isn't the end-all be-all, so a thorough body inspection is a big part. Okay, value versus price. People always think price is all that matters. Well, value is what you get in exchange for the price you pay. So the more expensive car isn't necessarily the worst value, right? The more expensive car might be the better value. Try to buy the best car you can afford, but be careful what you get, what you pay for. This is actually getting better as the market's cooling a little bit, which is actually nice. But I've had some people say, well, I bought the most expensive one, so therefore I got the best one. No, you could have, but not necessarily, right? The other thing is the best value is the car that best suits your needs, desires, and intended usage. So, perfect example, I just listed a 10,000 original mile 997 twin turbo, and a client of mine called me and he was just over the moon. He says, I want to come buy that car, what do you think? As he described his intended usage for it, he wants an open car. He wants to be able to share it with his wife, and she doesn't drive a manual. And they like to just kind of do short tours around town, and he says she's deathly afraid of me driving fast. And I said, well, he said, but I'm so in love with that car, it's so neat. And I said, but it doesn't fit what you're trying to do, right? So buy the car that fits whatever your needs are, and then when in doubt, enlist the help of a trusted advisor. That's the beautiful thing about the PCA. There's a wealth of knowledge in this room that's unbelievable. So when you're looking for a car, find the person in your club that has, there's always that one person that's had 4 of that model. That's probably the person you want to talk to, right? And then real quick, places to find them. I try to find all my cars through the PCA, through a network of, I'll meet people here and they'll come approach me and say, hey, I've got this car. So that's your first network in your local group. Put word out if you're looking for something, or if you're trying to sell something, please keep it in the family. I'm a firm believer in that. Of course, reputable dealers, I put that in asterisk. I said with a little caveat, we didn't get the bad reputation for nothing, right? The other thing is don't assume a private party is necessarily more honest. I find in general they try to be more honest, but I have this honesty versus ignorance. Some of it is they just don't know any different, right? It's that original paint question. Maybe they don't really know. Auction cars, and by auction I mean collector car auctions, not dealer auctions, right? Proceed with caution, right? There could be some really good cars there, but you don't really have a great chance to vet the car like you would if you can talk to the owner and drive the car and get a PPI done. So you got to go in with really, really good eyes on that one. And then all your online is where you're going to find most of this stuff. The PCA has a great classified. I love it. Auto Trader, Craigslist, Pelican Parts. All your different online venues are better depending on your car. So this might be talking to an expert. Like if I've got an early long hood car, it's better on early S, as long as I have thick skin. Any early S guys in the room? You gotta have thick skin if you're gonna list a car on early S. They're gonna just chastise you to no end, but just know that's coming, right? If I got a G-body car, Pelican's probably my winning spot. If I have a 993, Renlist is my spot, right? 356 registry, it's pretty self-explanatory where's a good spot there. Bring a Trailer, who's familiar with Bring a Trailer, right? Bring a Trailer's done an awesome job of marketing these cars. Kind of a fun way to waste a day or weeks of your life. And eBay has its pros and cons, but it's certainly worth looking at. Everyone's worried about fraud, so if you're going to buy or sell a car, just a couple things to know. Showing up with a suitcase of cash in 2016, not good, right? I kid you not, I have people that show up with sometimes I've had people I'm going to buy their car and they say, I want cash. Well, buddy, you're not going to get cash, Nobody wants that much cash. People are always concerned about cashier's checks. I buy my cars pretty much exclusively either with a wire transfer or a cashier's check where I go do it in person. So almost everyone in America has a Chase, a Wells Fargo, a B of A account. So I have an account in one of those places. If I want to buy a car, we'll walk in together and I can at least watch them print the check off or vice versa. I know it's probably pretty good at that point. Wire transfers are... people are worried about it, but actually they're very, very safe, except that to know with a wire transfer, once the money's sent, it's done. So make darn sure you've got everything all sorted out with your buyer. Don't just send someone blindly a wire. The other thing is title. Because the market's been going up so much and so many guys try to be someone like me, You'd be amazed how often they have the title and it's not in their name. If the title's not in their name, they do not own the car. Right? Oh, it was my brother. Well, what you find out, it's a lot of guys that are cute in states like California or Washington. We have a very high sales tax rate. Car won't pass smog, so they wouldn't transfer it. They don't want to pay the sales tax. There's something goofy. I know it sounds kind of jerky, but just make sure the title's in their name. You're going to give them money for a car, you better make sure it's theirs so someone doesn't pop up and say, actually that's mine. Same thing with lien. California, I believe, is a state where if there's a lien, the lien holder physically holds the title. Does everyone know not every state's that way? Believe it or not, there's states, if you have a lien on your car, you still get the title. There's also states, Montana is a perfect example. When a car is liened in Montana, you get the title and the lien holder's name's not even on it. Yeah, so that's a scary one. Someone says, oh, here's the title. Well, you go to transfer it and they say, oh, USAA has a lien for $60,000 against this car. Yeah. I only tell you that because I found this with custom. This has actually happened. So when in doubt, a simple call or a trip down to your local DMV will help clear that up, right? This is kind of involved, so I won't cover it, but there are ways to make sure you handle a lien. So with that, I'm going to exit out because I'm way over time here. So.